So today our topic for discussion is crop classification and structure. We're going to talk about the various ways that crops are classified, and there's a laboratory that deals with this in more detail with regard to agronomic type classifications and uses of crops. And so this sort of goes along with that, and you should be viewing that laboratory sometime this same week. And we'll talk about structure too. We're mostly going to be looking at the roots, the stems, the leaves, and we'll leave the flower structure off for another day. So first we want to deal with taxonomic classification, and your textbook calls this the botanical classification or the scientific classification. There's various ways of classifying anything, but in biology we have what is known as the taxonomic system. And we classify everything from the kingdom that they're in all the way down to the genus, the families, the genus, the species, and the cultivar. And there's a complete classification in your textbook for the wheat plant, or the species of wheat, a particular cultivar of wheat, so you can follow that all the way through. And starting at the top, all crop plants are angiosperms. They're flowering or seed-bearing plants. Now there are some exceptions to that with regard to some of our forest crop plants. Trees, pine trees for example, are not angiosperms. They're gymnosperms. They're not quite as evolutionarily advanced as angiosperms. And some of the other related evergreen species are not angiosperms. But by and large, most everything that we eat and use as a crop plant is going to be an angiosperm, with those notable exceptions. The angiosperms evolved on Earth about 132 million years ago. This would be during the early Cretaceous period. They came along with the first mammals. They sort of co-evolved with the first mammals. The disappearance of the dinosaurs had already been around for several million years by this time, and they actually were destroyed or made extinct around 60 million years ago. So the dinosaurs still had about 70 million years to go at this point. And the mammals were very, very small animals that primarily escaped the notice of the dinosaurs during this period, these very early mammals. But the angiosperms evolved about this time. The flowering plants and seed-bearing plants evolved about this time. So we can divide the angiosperms into two basic groups. These two groups differ significantly in their structural and physiological differences. If you think about the differences between a corn plant or a wheat plant, for example, and a cotton plant, they're in these two different. Each one of them is representative of these two different groups. The wheat is a grass and a monocot, and the cotton plant is a dicot or a broadleaf plant. And the monocots, which include the grasses. There are about 30,000 species of monocots, 10,000 species of grasses alone. So the grasses make up the biggest group of the monocots. The monocots are characterized by having an embryo with one cotyledon or seed leaf, and they have a fibrous root system, a root system that tends to grow in such a way that basically you get a network of roots instead of a single tap root like you're going to see down here with the monocots that have and all these are illustrated very nicely in your textbook. But the dicots tend to have a tap root with branches, a branched root system like that, as opposed to the fibrous or net root system of the monocots. The cotyledons, the cotyledon part of the seed is something we'll deal with in laboratory. Monocots have parallel leaf venation. You see that illustrated over here, where all the veins tend to run in the same direction. The dicots have net leaf venation, or the veins. There may be a central vein, and there'll be branch veins that radiate away from that, and each one of those will in turn have secondary and tertiary branch veins, but it tends to have much more of a net type appearance. Some examples of monocots are going to include the grasses, as I said, corn, wheat, and rice. Other monocots that are not grasses include the lily, orchids, and sedges. The monocots actually came along after dicots. Dicots were the first angiosperms that evolved, and then later the monocots evolved from that. They have other metabolic differences that we'll discuss also. Examples of the dicots include the cotton, the bean, sweet potato, tomato, and there are many other examples of dicotyledonous crop plants, as there are many other examples of monocotyledonous crop plants. The system of classification that we use mostly in describing plants and giving their scientific name, of course, is the binomial system that was developed by the Swedish botanist Linnaeus, and that is the genus and species. And we'll talk about this in the laboratory in greater detail. Genus is the first word. Here's the genus name of corn, and this is maize is the species name of corn. So corn, the scientific name for corn is Zea maize, and you'll notice that it's underlined. Normally we would either underline it or put the scientific name in italics because it's in a foreign language. It is in the language of Latin. The L at the end signifies the authority that put that plant in that classified that plant in that particular genus and species. In this case, when you see an L, that refers to Linnaeus. He classified many plants, and as a result of that, the first letter of his last name is included as the full part of the scientific name. The soybean, the scientific name is Glycine max, first classified by Linnaeus, and then later changed by a fellow by the name of Merrill. So you'll see other names occasionally in these scientific names. Some of the important crop families that we have, above the genus level, we go to the family level, and there are many families of plants. In fact, there are 453 total families, but there are not all that many that have economic importance. These are some of the more important ones that I've got listed here. There are others. For example, onion, carrot, or peach and grape do not appear on this list, but they are certainly very important crop plants. Of the most importance, of course, is the Poaceae, or the grass family. And in parenthesis, after these are the grasses, these are the crop plants that we talk about that I list first. And then in parenthesis afterwards, I list plants that are weed species that are also in this family. So in a lot of cases, we have important crops in a particular family, and then we have weeds that are also important in that particular family. And it's often good to know what the related weed species are, because sometimes that can have an impact on your decision as to what herbicides you might use. Two plants that are closely related, in other words, in the same family, might be more difficult to manage with a selective herbicide. Second most important on the list is the family Fabaceae, or the legumes. The legumes include all the beans, the peas, many of our forages such as alfalfa, and weed examples are going to be sickle pod, Florida beggarweed. So there's a lot of weedy legumes as well. These two families, the grasses and the legumes, provide the majority of the calories needed on this planet. When you've got your grasses and you've got your beans, you've covered a lot of territory there. Third in line would be the Solanaceous plants, or the family Solanaceae. Solanaceae, the family Solanaceae is characterized by its wide variety of plants, crop plants, such as the white potato, the tomato, tobacco, pepper, all of these plants, and you could also add out here eggplant, and there are others. All of these, this is also referred to as the nightshade family. These all have common names. This is often referred to as the grass family. This is often referred to as the legume family. This is often referred to as the nightshade family because of the weed species, nightshades, that are in it. This is the mallow family. M-A-L-L-O-W. Let me see if I can write that so it can be read. M-A-L-L-O-W. This is the mallow family. and then there are others that we'll look at here in a minute. The Solanaceous plants, some of the weedy species are the nightshade and the Jimson weed, and there are others. The Malvaceae, or the mallow family, includes cotton and okra. Some of the also hibiscus is here. It's an ornamental, and you'll notice that if you look at hibiscus, if you look at some of these plants, for example, these plants in the family of Malvaceae, the thing that they have in common, if you look at them, is that their flower structure is very similar. They all have flowers that look alike. If you look at a hibiscus flower, for example, it looks very, very similar to a flower that would be on an okra plant or on a cotton plant. Teaweed and velvet leaf are two weedy species in that family. The Compositae family includes sunflower and safflower. These are major oilseed crops. Bitterweed is also a member of that family. The crucifers, cruciferae, the mustard family, cabbage, wild radish is a weed in that particular family. This is another family that contains a lot of different species that we use economically. If you look at cabbage, for example, there's several different varieties of plants that really are in the same genus and species as cabbage. Brussels sprouts, broccoli, various types of other related brassicad plants, kale, for example, and others, many others. Bok choy is in this group. Chenopodiaceae, the sugar beet family or the beet family. Polygonaceae, the buckwheat family. Convolvulaceae, the sweet potato family, and its relative, the morning glory, is the weed. And then again, we got the Rosaceae, which is apples and roses and many other species. There's lots of other species that you can put in these other families, but the most important ones as far as agronomics are concerned are these, and 70% of the cropland is devoted to grass plants to start with, of some sort, grain crops of some sort, and then your legumes and your Solanaceae. The Solanaceae family provides us a lot of the variety that we need. You can't make a pizza without pepper or tomatoes, for example, and some of the best eggplant I've ever eaten came from was served in China. And the white potato, of course. These are all very important plants for variety and give us the wide variety of plants that we need. Let's look at the morphology. A little bit about morphology here. We're not going to study this in any great detail, but we'll start with the roots, since they're the part that's underground. And we don't see roots, and they don't get nearly the attention that other plant parts, the above ground plant parts, do. And as I said, the monocots and the dicots are divided into their two groups based on the differences in their root morphology. The monocots having the fibrous roots that we see here in this picture on the left, the fibrous roots, and the dicots having, in this case, this is an extreme example of a dicot, big fat taproot here. This is probably a beet plant or something that has a very large taproot that is actually the product of what you're trying to harvest and you're trying to produce. So we have the two different types of root systems. What do roots do for plants? How do they function? Well, they function in several ways. The most important thing that they do is in the absorption of water and nutrients. This is where the plants get their water and get their nutrients. And this is illustrated in figure, or some of the differences here are illustrated in figure 7-5 on page 90 of your text. I always try to look in the text when I refer to the text and see the diagrams that are there. The water and nutrients are absorbed through the root hairs. Now let's make sure that we differentiate here. We have the word nutrient here, and we differentiate between two things for plants. One of them is food, and the other is the nutrients. Food is going to be primarily sugar, photosynthate. The food is actually produced by the plant. The plants need food, they need sugars, but they produce their own sugars and produce their own food through photosynthesis. Nutrients are things like N, P, K, copper, iron, magnesium, calcium. We'll look at those in detail later on, and others. But when we talk about nutrients, we're talking about elements, the things that plants must get from the soil in order to be able to do what they do with regard to photosynthesis. This absorption occurs primarily through the root hairs. They're tiny single cell projections from the root surface. Roots are growing continuously into new soil areas. They don't necessarily sense the presence of nutrients. They just grow and they encounter nutrients as they go. And water. Roots also function in anchorage and support. They hold the plant down. Plants don't get up and walk around. There's some plants that do pull up their roots and go sometimes as a means of seed dissemination. Tumbleweed is a good example of that, but by and large plants stay in one place. They transport water and nutrients from the root to the upper parts of the plants where they're used. They can store food being sugar, remember, or starches in some cases, sugar being converted to starches. So I could go up here, and we also could refer to food as sugar or the stored form of starch. And roots also function as a site of infixation in legumes. Remember, the legumes, or the Fabaceae family, is a family of plants including the beans and alfalfa, peas, peanut, these are the important ones, peanuts. And these plants fix their own nitrogen. They get nitrogen from the atmosphere through a relationship with certain bacteria that live in soil and colonize the roots of these plants. These plants have evolved a mechanism, a symbiotic relationship with certain bacteria. The bacteria actually take the nitrogen, extract the nitrogen from the atmosphere, and make it so that the plants can use it. Plants normally cannot absorb nitrogen from the atmosphere. Legumes do have this capacity through their symbiotic relationship with these bacteria. And only in this particular family does this occur, the Fabaceae family. So it happens on the roots. The roots are colonized, and I'll show how this is done when we talk about some of these particular leguminous crops a little bit later on. Roots are generally about 1/3 to 1/4 of the total plant dry weight. So they don't make up the majority of the plant dry weight. They may, however, even though they weigh less, they may have up to 100 times the surface area of the above ground plant parts, because it's important that they have a lot of surface area to come in contact with as much soil and soil particles as possible to be able to absorb the nutrients and the water that's there. Stems and shoots, a little bit about nomenclature here. In grasses, in the family Poaceae, a hollow stem is called a culm. A hollow stem would be something like a wheat stem, for example, or a rice stem. You know, they even call wheat stems straw when it's been harvested. So it's a hollow stem. A solid stem is called a stalk. This would be a type of stem you would see in corn, a corn stalk. We use that term when we're talking about corn. Structure of stems. The two main things we're interested here are the nodes. This is where leaves and other structures join the main stem, and they generally are areas of compressed tissue. They give, as you can see here, they give rise to leaves, they give rise to other stems, or they may give rise to plant reproductive parts. So you have your nodes, and then you have the area between nodes. Here's nodes. Here's again a node down here. You have this area between nodes is known as the internode. Now, when you have nodes, if there are nodes on any part of a plant, that identifies that plant part as a stem. So if it has nodes, it's a stem. If it has these areas of compressed tissue that give rise to other plant parts, it's a stem. For example, a white potato has eyes, and the eyes are actually nodes, and these are the parts of the white potato that will sprout under the right environmental conditions. So they are capable of creating a new potato plant, and in fact that's how we propagate potatoes. Some types of modified stems that we have include there's the basic stem that is vertical and has the leaves and other stems attached to it, but we have modifications, one of which I've already mentioned, that being the one modified stem being the tuber, the potato. The tuber is an underground stem, greatly enlarged. This is, again, the potato is a good example, usually found on annual plants. Potatoes with the eyes being nodes. Because the nodes are there, it is a stem, so it's classified not as a root, even though it grows underground, but as a tuber. We also have stolons. Stolons are lateral above ground stems. Basically, you have your plant, you have your soil line here with your root system, and you have your plant with some leaves on it, and you may have here a lateral tissue that will give rise to another plant with leaves on it, or even more, and you can keep on reproducing. Many of our weed species reproduce this way. It makes them tough to control, but they're just lateral above ground stems. Above ground is the key word here, usually found only on perennials. Strawberries, for example, reproduce this way. This is how we get new strawberry plants. Coastal Bermuda grass, which is a forage grass, reproduces also through the use of stolons. A crown is a compressed stem from which you get tillers, usually found in small grains. Again, if we have our plant here with our fibrous root system in this case, and we have our stem, you may get areas here where other plants come up. You have, in this case, you might have a seed head here up at the top. You would have other seed heads on these also, and this is how you get a lot of your extra yield from these plants. These structures here are referred to as tillers, and they come from this area of tissue down here right about at the soil line. Usually these are found in small grains. Rhizomes are very similar to stolons. The big difference between a rhizome and a stolon is that the rhizome grows underground laterally, and any plant's not going to have both. There's a diagram in your textbook of a plant that has both rhizomes and stolons, but it's not a real plant. It's a drawing. Johnson grass is known to have an extensive rhizome system. And again, plants reproduce through these structures. We've already talked about tubers. Bulbs are compressed modified stems with leaves. An onion is a good example of a bulb. And a corm is a short vertical underground stem. It's usually just not as meaty. Basically, it's very similar to a bulb. It just doesn't have quite the mass to it. It doesn't have the mass of leaves associated with it. We have these in taro, the crocus plant, and gladiolus. Corms are not really all that important in agronomic crop plants. Now, one of the major characteristics of stems is the characteristic of apical dominance. Stems possess this, particularly in monocots. They possess this particularly in the dicots. The monocots have a little different stem growth characteristic that we'll discuss in laboratory, but with apical dominance, what we mean, apex means top, and we know what dominate means, so we have what you call as a top down or a top dominance type of stem. You have a plant that grows, and it will have nodes here, and up here at the top you get a hormone produced, auxin, that inhibits the growth of these lateral stems. Now, as your top moves further and further away from these stems, they will start to grow. And so what you'll eventually wind up with is a plant that the typical Christmas tree shape of a plant. Most of our crop plants will have this type of Christmas tree shape. Not all of them, but it's very typical because you've got these lateral branches that are growing here and producing more stems and less up here at the top. These buds generally will not function most of the time unless the apex is farther away or has been removed. If you remove this, then you'll get, and this can happen in a couple of different ways. But if you remove this, let's say you'll get, let's say we've removed the top part of this plant, then we'll start to see a lot of these lateral stems start to grow because this apex has been removed and this inhibitory effect has been in essence removed and stimulating these lateral buds to start growing. You can also see this when plants lodge. Let's see if I can diagram that right quick. If a plant falls over, for example, this is lodging, and you'll see because the apex is now down here, you'll see a plant start producing extra stems that way. So the functions of stems are support and display of leaves. Of course, that's what they do. They support flowers and fruits. This should have an F right here. They transport water and nutrients from the roots up to the leaves. It can store food in a limited sort of way. They function in asexual propagation. Primarily our tubers, our stolons, our rhizomes. This is their primary function, to function as a way of propagating plants. They can conduct, above ground stems at least, can conduct some level of photosynthesis, but it's generally not important in crops. They are green parts of the plant, so they do conduct photosynthesis. It's just not really contributes a whole lot to plant productivity. Now let's get back to this issue of lodging. Lodging I mentioned previously just a minute ago. It's a major problem in some plants. And what happens with lodging is that plants fall over, and when the plant falls over, this is not good. A plant falls over, you get all of your whatever you're producing, which is generally going to be the grains or whatever. All that's going to be lost. It's hard to harvest these things from the ground, so we want as much as possible to eliminate lodging in a cropping situation. We do not want lodging to occur. It can be caused by several things, mainly weak stems. Something weakens the stem and causes the plant to fall over. Excess fertilizer can do it, causes too much vegetative growth. Excess water can do it, causes too much vegetative growth. You get excess weight in the above ground part of the plant and it will just fall over. High plant populations where your plants are competing with one another for sunlight. Again, shading goes along with this. Shading and competition goes along with this. Diseases and insects. Diseases and insects can damage the plant stem, causing the plant to fall over. And then, of course, there's the contribution of genetics. Some varieties or cultivars of plants are simply more prone to lodging than others, and you can breed and design plants to resist lodging, and that's one of the major objectives of many breeding programs, is to prevent lodging. We don't see as much lodging as we used to because we have developed plant cultivars that are very resistant to lodging. Here's an example of lodging that occurred in a wheat field. You can see the wheat, the healthy wheat in the background here and surrounding it here, but something happened. It could have been wind. These stems were weakened, and it's almost like a domino effect. As you can see, once lodging starts, it can spread. These plants are not terribly far from being ready to harvest, but harvest is going to present a lot of difficulties here in a situation where you've had lodging. And you can see in this field, in this photograph here, you have whole areas. Here's a whole block here which is entirely lodged. Now, why would that be when you have on either side of it a healthy looking wheat? Probably, and I don't know the answer to this question, but my guess is that it's probably due to a different variety that's planted here. A lot of these plots here may be farmed by different farmers, or you don't know, the farmer may have just put in a different cultivar here, and this cultivar tended to be more susceptible to lodging. So we go now to leaves. Last but not least, of course, are the leaves. A couple of terms that we use when we talk about leaves is the concept of a leaf canopy. The leaf canopy is the configuration of all plant leaves in the field. So we talk about a leaf canopy in such a way that we use that term as a descriptor. Do we have a healthy canopy, or do we not have a healthy canopy? Do we have complete canopy coverage of the soil, or do we not have complete canopy coverage of the soil? Of course, the leaf canopy is not something that's going to develop right away. It takes time from planting until you get a good leaf canopy, all the leaves in the field functioning together to do what it is they do. One of the things that they do, of course, is cover soil and intercept sunlight. So you need a good, healthy leaf canopy for that. The leaf area index is another concept here that we like to introduce, the LAI, which is nothing more than the leaf area of a field divided by the soil area. So if we measure all the leaves in an acre, for example, in 1 acre, and we measure the area on one side of the leaf, for a good healthy leaf canopy, we need that leaf area index to be about 2.5 to 4. So you'll need about 2.5 times the leaf area as you have soil area, at least 2.5 times or 4 times the leaf area. Now, why do you need so much extra area? Well, a lot of those leaves are older, they're not functioning very well, they may be diseased, they need to be at different angles to intercept sun at different times of the day most efficiently. So we need a leaf area index of 2.5 to 4 for most of our crops. What do leaves do? Very simply, they function as the main site of photosynthesis. This is where sunlight and water and carbon dioxide are come together to make sugar. So we want to produce food for the plant, food for us. This is what we're doing. This is our business, exploitation of photosynthesis. They function to a limited extent in storage of food and starches. They translocate food. They move that food that's been produced by photosynthesis to where it's needed. The stems, the growing stems, the roots, or whatever. They function in gaseous exchange. CO2 comes into the leaf. Oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis passes out through structures, leaf holes called stomates. And they also function in transpiration, which is the loss of water also through the stomates. The loss of water is a cooling effect on the leaf. Just like when we transpire, we actually perspire, and we tend to cool our bodies that way. So this is one of the major, water loss of course is a major problem because plants need water, and when they lose water through the leaf, they need to take water up from the soil to replace it, and so that's why that constant need for water is there. We're going to discuss a little more about these things, the gaseous exchange and transpiration, when we talk next in our next session about plant metabolism. The flowers, again, we're not going to talk too much about flowers now. We have a whole section on flowers, their structure, what they do, how they do it, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. As far as anatomy is concerned, the internal structure, the internal stem structure, we haven't mentioned much about that. I'm just going to mention it here somewhat briefly. The two main tissues that we need to be concerned about are the water conducting tissue, or the xylem, one of the few words in a dictionary that actually starts with X, the xylem, and the food conducting tissue. So you have tissue that conducts water, you have tissues that conduct food. There are two different vascular systems that do this. These are called vascular tissues, just like we have vascular tissues in our bodies, the veins and the arteries. These are things that move things from one place to another. The phloem is the vascular tissue that moves food or sugars, and it is sugars that are moved through the phloem. So the conducting tissue, the water conducting tissue, the xylem, conducts both water and nutrients. Again, nutrients, N, P, K, etc. And the food is sugar going through the phloem. Generally speaking, water, the phloem conducts stuff upwardly, the phloem conducts stuff downwardly, but not necessarily. It can go in different directions because of wherever the sugar is needed. And again, collectively, these are referred to as the vascular tissue. And along with this comes the concept of a couple of things here. The concept of a source versus a sink. Probably almost every exam has some question related to these two things and what they are. And we want you to give an example. So pay attention here. A source is considered to be a source of photosynthate, source of food. And a source of food in a plant is going to be a photosynthesizing leaf. A sink is where food is used. Sugar for growth. This is going to be a developing fruit or flower. A root, for example, that is growing. It takes energy for these roots to grow. They have to get that energy from food, from the photosynthate produced by the plant, the growing point of a plant. And sinks are classified. You have the source and the sink. You have these source-sink relationships. Sinks are generally classified as either a strong sink versus a weak sink. Strong sinks are those where most growth is occurring, such as a developing fruit or the growing point of the plant. A weaker sink may be where not much growth is happening, but the maintenance is occurring, such as part of the root system or part of the stem system. And both of these types of tissues, either the xylem or the phloem, can be affected by root and stem diseases. This is what one of the major things that root and stem diseases do to plants, is they plug up the vascular system. They plug up the vascular system so it can't work properly. And when that happens, you've got severe problems. This is a cartoon drawing here of a xylem vessel showing movement in an upward direction, with water here being sort of in blue. Water and minerals or nutrients are inside here, sort of a continuous channel. A phloem vessel is a little different. It's not a continuous channel, but you do have movement in both directions. So that's the end of today's discussion on crop classification and structure. Next we'll move on to plant metabolism.